Do you remember those days back when the newspaper boy would deliver the newspaper every morning or every afternoon, wherever you are? My, how things have changed. How have they changed? What's going on in the newspaper industry in general and in Western New York in particular? And where is it headed? We're going to be learning all about that on today's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report, which as always is brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Mendon Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hi there, and welcome again to this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Hey, if you're listening live, and only if you're listening live, and you'd like to ask a question, be sure to put it in the chat room, and I'll ask one of our expert guests, whatever you'd like me to. Who are our expert guests today? Well, we've got two of them. Tom Silvestri, he's from the Relevance Project, a national organization that is involved in helping newspapers enter into the 21st century in a way, and Michelle Ray, she's the executive director of the New York Press Association. Let's start with Michelle. Michelle, can you give us a kind of a overview of the state of newspapers today and maybe why we are where we're at?
Sure. Well, actually, the timing of this program is interesting. This week, Medill University released a study that talks about the dramatic decreases in the number of newspapers being published nationwide. It talks specifically about counties where there are no newspapers any longer, which this study defines as a news desert. It talks about how we expected digital media to replace the losses in print media, but that hasn't happened. It talks about ownership and how many, in 25 companies, own the majority of newspapers across the United States now. It talks about how those companies are run by hedge funds and don't seem to care as much about journalism and the community as independently owned newspapers do and always did. New York is slightly different than most states in that we have the smallest amount of chain ownership per capita of any state in the country. New York still has more than 500 newspapers. We have 414 weeklies. We have 51 dailies, and we have 98 non-English newspapers. I'm sorry for that. We are seeing a decline in the number of newspapers, largely because publicly traded companies like Gannett are closing newspapers. In Western New York, they closed 8 really critical weeklies in the Rochester area last year. We find it difficult for people to step in and take over those markets. There isn't a huge amount of interest. That said, nationally, there are some foundations and nonprofit entities that are trying to regenerate interest in ownership of newspapers across the country. We'll see how that plays out in New York.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Tom, you're involved in this project. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Relevancy Project, maybe how you got involved, and what are some of the examples that you've been involved with regard to it and how it works?
Well, first of all, thanks, Chris, for having me on the program. I'm a New York native. I grew up in the Westchester area, but had relatives in your area, so it's good to be with you today. It's an honor. And it's also an honor to follow Michelle, who is one of the originators of the project that I'm working on. It's called the Relevance Project. And the more I hang around that word, the relevance, the more I see that as a mindset for helping newspapers find their way through to a sustainable future. I have to give it out and shout out to all of the state press associations in the United States and the provincial press associations in Canada who form an umbrella group through their executive directors on an unusual group called Newspaper Association Managers, who decided to, in addition to their very important work, add an initiative that would basically help support efforts for newspapers to sustain themselves, continue to do their important work, but more importantly, because of the digital disruption, to try to figure out new paths to a future at a very interesting time. I'm a baby boomer, and a lot of the owners of newspapers are baby boomers, and we're seeing an unprecedented number of transfer of ownership in newspapers. So we have a lot of major issues. And so NAM, the Newspaper Association Managers, decided to create and fund this project, and I was fortunate enough to become the point person. And basically, this is an initiative to help newspapers tell the true story of their strength and viability despite all of the challenges. The challenges are almost a cliche. Many, many, many industries have challenges, so newspapers aren't alone on that. But just like other industries that are going through different types of problems and different types of challenges, they've got to figure out the future. My role is to help local newspapers through their press association strengthen their franchises and reclaim the narrative about their future. I'm doing that in three ways. One, I'm trying to provide as much revenue promotional work to talk about the importance of once a reader reads an ad in a newspaper, it is trusted and it causes them and motivates them to take action. So the ads are still very effective. I'm also trying to provide resources to the newsrooms. There's a lot of organizations helping out newsrooms. I'm trying to find niches where we can help newsrooms tell their story, but more importantly, support why their role was so important in a democracy. But the one and that's pretty much the first work on this project. But the one I'm really excited about is this notion that newspapers should become the community forum. And I know, Chris, you understand this. This whole program you're doing today is an excellent example of that. A newspaper trying to connect with their audience through conversation and important programs, in addition to putting out valuable newspapers. But in essence, a community forum is a way to use civic conversations to invite the public to analyze those problems and work at helping the community solve their own problems. In addition to for newspapers to talk about their own situation and also to address issues like, the disinformation that's happening all around us that interrupt sane information from getting to readers. When I was a publisher in Richmond, Virginia, where I'm currently based for 15 years, and we had a similar initiative. We called it the Public Square, and I moderated 78 over 15 years conversations of civic importance, where we invited the community in to hear subject matter experts, but more importantly, to allow each member of the community to have a voice on what they thought the community should be doing to affect positive change. We can get a little bit more into the community forum that you like, but I think newspapers, in order to, as they figure out their future, by becoming the community forum, become more in tune, address the polarization that's going on, address the need for a unifying force, and more importantly, show that they can be a moderator of civil intercourse and to encourage other people to be more empowered to solve problems in the community and not leave it just to government, make it a whole unifying thing. So I think newspapers are ideally and uniquely situated to be the moderator of that conversation. So it's respectful, it can be passionate, but it can be powerful in moving the community along. I know you understand that, Chris.
Yeah, and in fact, historically, that's a role that newspapers have played maybe not originally. Originally, they were kind of agitators, but certainly in the 20th century, as the media evolved, newspapers played a critical role in bringing the community together and helping this civil discourse move forward. Michelle, we have a question from someone in the audience that I think you might be able to answer. It's a general question. Just can you give your thoughts on how did newspapers get to where they are right now? What happened that caused the decline in readership? Is it all the internet's fault, or did this start before we even knew what the internet was?
I mean, there's a lot of finger pointing and critiquing going on, saying that the newspaper industry was late to the party and we should have understood the impact of digital. But frankly, newspapers are in a breaking news business. They're on deadline every hour of every day, and the ground is changing under their feet. So expecting them to innovate while they were just trying to stay even I think is unrealistic, even when you look back at it. And as we look forward, as I said earlier, digital news organizations have not proliferated, nor have they captured the share of the audience market that anybody anticipated them to do. So while we might have been late to the game, I'm not sure that getting to the game on time would have provided a different news landscape. I think one of the things that is impacting us the most right now is the way young people get their news. Young people don't seem to access traditional news services. They tend to access everything through social media on their phones, and it's a clip from here and a clip from there. So they're not getting a complete picture from one source. Whether they're getting a complete picture or not is questionable, but they're definitely not getting it from one source any longer.
You know, it's funny that you say that. Yesterday, I was in a conversation with a group of people, and I tried to explain the demographics of the different generations and how this younger generation really consumes its content much differently than the older generation has traditionally done. I was immediately attacked as being ageist because, well, there's certainly older people who consume the news the same way, and that's true, they do. But if you look at the broader demographics, where the trends are going, generations are different and how news is consumed. As a newspaper publisher, I can tell you firsthand the demographics of my subscribers, and they follow that generational theory quite well. Tom, there's a question on the community forum aspect. I'm going to translate it over to this.
Okay.
You've done these community forums. Can you kind of take us through how you've done it and what the results were, what the end results of those community forums were in terms of both what the paper reported on and how the community became better engaged in the process of making news?
Sure. Thanks for that question. I'm happy to do so. Why was I an early adopter of community forums? Well, when I became publisher, I walked around the community and I was really surprised and almost shocked about how folks thought the paper was aloof from the community, didn't really care about some of the issues to the degree that some of the solution seekers were doing. And I said, I've got to do something to show that the newspaper is responsive to the community. We can put out a great news report, and we did, but we got to do something else. And I had been involved in a group called Leadership Metro Richmond, which spent a whole year looking at the community, and they did a lot of small group conversations with the class members and allowed them access to newsmakers, and it was very beneficial. I thought, that's a pretty good model to kind of think about for my paper, the Richmond Times-Dispatch. So in essence, the community forum's first step is a town hall concept, and the town hall concept is you set a topic, you put it in a question form to invite people to answer, you invite them in, and you give them a microphone for 3 or 5 minutes for them to sound off or to sound in to solutions. And we did it with various formats. So if I picked a topic like there was a new performing arts center, does Richmond need a performing arts center? I would invite a couple of subject matter experts in to take the first 15, 20 minutes to give the broad overview of the topic. And then I would ask a few questions, and then we turn to the audience and allow them access to people making news or people trying to also, like them, solve problems. We went about 90 minutes, and as long as I left enough time for the audience to ask questions, the town hall was interactive. We had one rule, and that was civil discourse. We were not going to be cable TV where people were going to talk over each other and yell at each other. And what we found through the 78, that listening was as much an active sport as talking, and that people sort of wanted to hear what their neighbors had to say. And the neat thing about it being in a newspaper building, because the public squares were mostly in our auditorium, was that the newspaper would then knit the story in a coherent weave of what actually was said and what actually was advocated. And we did one other thing. We printed the transcript of the entire public square. And in 90 minutes, one of the squares got nearly 30 people speaking. We ran each of their comments and each of their pictures. And what we were able to transform the newspaper into, in addition to being a news source, it was also a listening source and a place where you could feel confident that your voice could be heard and you could learn something. After the 90 minutes ended, it was often the common situation where people stayed in the room about an hour later because they met somebody who either had an opposing view or like view, and they wanted to talk further. And I think what we saw was there was very few safe places where people could go to talk about issues of importance. And in today's world, there are a lot of issues of importance. And until you give people voice, they give up. So what the paper was able to do with the town hall concept was to show they were interested. And by being the inviter, they became the attractor of people, like-minded people or different-minded people who could go to one place and have that conversation and be respected for it, even if they disagreed. So what it did was it uplifted the newspaper's position. And I've been retired for more than 2 years, and I'm still getting people asking me when the next public square is. So my role with the Relevance Project is try to ignite these community forums throughout North America. Right now, we've got an experiment going on in Mississippi through an unusual partnership with newspapers, the Mississippi Press Association, and Mississippi Humanities to put on these civil discourses because there are people worried about democracy. And when people start giving up on the exchange of ideas, on the exploration of solutions in a civil way, it's a threat. And I don't want to go overboard on it, but the best communities are the united communities, even though they disagree. They find a way to use that disagreement to make a better solution. And I'd like to see newspapers be at the center of that.
All right. That's great, Tom. We're going to take a quick break here. Bob, I know you've got a question. It's a really good question. Michelle, get ready for his question. When we come back, we'll go to Bob's question, and then we'll talk a little bit about newspapers in the greater Western New York region.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back to the State of Greater Western New York report. And we've got another question from the audience, this one from Bob. Michelle, you could probably take this one on. It's a really great question. Bob's wondering, will there even be ink in 25 years? And let me expand on that. There are issues, there are resource issues that newspapers face, including newsprint, including delivery, whether it's through the post office or other means. These constraints might be an issue in coming years. Talk a little bit about that and answers Bob's question about the ink.
Bob, I don't have a crystal ball, so I really can't answer that question. What I will say is that Chris's point is very well taken. Paper and ink are extremely expensive. Paper especially, there's only one mill left in the United States. All of the rest of the paper has to come from Canada. So for a lot of states, getting paper here is really expensive. And actually, I sort of misspeak. It used to come almost exclusively from Canada. Now some of it comes from Europe because there isn't enough supply. Because of Amazon and a lot of delivery logistics, A lot of the mills that formerly produced newsprint are now producing corrugated cardboard for all of the boxes that those delivery entities use. So the capacity for newsprint is greatly diminished, which increases the price. There is, however, a sort of fatal attraction, if you will, for print. People still like hardcover books. They still like glossy magazines. There's nothing like the impact of a full page, 4-color print ad. It's just a very powerful medium still. Whether or not it will exist, I don't know, but I actually don't know that I really care. I don't care what platform you get your news on, as long as the source of your news is a really credible news source and you're not getting misinformation or part of the story.
Well, one of the things that I always tell people is you can't clip out a digital screen and put it on a magnet on your refrigerator. So when your kid's story is in the paper, that's what parents do, or grandparents. They clip it out and they stick it up on the refrigerator so they can see it, and anybody who visits them can see it. So that's something that really you can only have with newspapers. Although I suppose you could print out the digital copy, or print it out on paper and do it that way, but that doesn't seem as real as a newspaper. But who knows? I'm being a little bit romantic here. So let's go back to now the Western New York region specifically. Michelle, you started to talk about how things have changed definitely within the Rochester area, and these things called news deserts, places that once had newspapers that don't currently have newspapers. How, beyond Rochester, and within the greater Western New York area, are there any other areas that maybe are dry or desert-like right now, and what could be done to help them out?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the study that Medill released said that there are 2,500 news deserts in the United States and Canada right now. So yes, it's happening everywhere. Just to back up for a second, if I could, newspapers were never publicly traded until Al Newharth took Gannett public so that he could launch USA Today. And before newspapers were publicly traded, all of the independent owners lived in the towns where they published their newspapers. Their children went to the same schools. They bought cars from the same dealerships. They were accountable when they were in the supermarket in the produce aisle to some mother coming up and saying, your coverage of the high school football game or the school board meeting was lousy. They had a real connection to their communities. Many of these publicly traded entities no longer have publishers in the communities that they serve. They no longer have people talking to the Chamber of Commerce or the heads of government. They are no longer involved in raising money for the hospitals or the libraries. So they've lost their community connection. And that's something that's really important. When there is a news desert, resources are so slim that surrounding communities don't have the feet on the ground or the money to deliver very far away or to cover the communities that are in those counties. So it is a problem, Chris. Nonprofits are stepping in, civic organizations are stepping in, independent websites are popping up. But the problem is none of them have the resources that the industry used to have the number of reporters that was commensurate with the population that they're serving.
I think your point is well taken. The fact that you have some sort of existing home-based reporting, whether it's through the publishers or the reporters themselves, where you're out in the community. And again, I could tell you from experience that our minimal staff really interacts with the community, and I believe that helps the community feel better about the quality of reporting that they're getting. Sure, everyone makes mistakes, but it's great if there's a face that you could talk to about it and then see it corrected somehow. And I think that's what we're able to achieve. But this really isn't so much about me or our paper. It's really about the entire region. Tom, from your standpoint, now I know you're familiar with what we're doing with the Greater Western New York Town Hall meetings, which does cover the entire 17 counties in the Greater Western New York region. Compare that with what you've done. How is it different, and maybe what might excite you about it?
Well, let me just pick up on something that Michelle said and add to it. So, the future, it seems to be an isolated conversation to say that the future of newspapers is purely on newspapers to figure it out, and shame on newspapers for doing this and not doing that. The future of newspapers depends on their community support. It's okay to tell the newspapers they've got to earn that support. And they've got to earn it perhaps in addition to putting out being a great news source, but they've got to do more. And that's why the community involvement, there are some excellent examples of locally based publishers and locally based staffs doing what they're supposed to be doing, to the point where you never see a story about them. It's one issue about our industry that frustrates a lot of us, is that, you know, all the stories about the industry are about the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. And you could have papers in various locations of the country and even in the state doing great work, and only the local people know about that. So it gives the false impression that not everybody is doing well. You know, well is one of those words, but I think what's really excited about what you're doing in Greater Western New York is you're trying to engage the community, but at a time in which that whole region is trying to figure out what it wants to be, given the politics of New York. I haven't lived in New York in a while, but I follow it closely to have some understanding of what's going on. But I think it's really exciting that you're covering your local area, but using an approach like the Greater Western New York format, you see a bigger region. And so you're thinking geography, but you're also thinking region and commonality in a place in New York State, that if they all work together, the result could be greater. If they're isolated, they might get defeated more often by the more powerful locations in New York. I find that exciting, and I find that exciting that you're in the middle of it. You know, conventional thinking would be a local publisher couldn't do this. They just need to stick to their netting and cover their community in their own Main Street. You see a bigger need, your community sees it also, and they're working with you to make sure that conversation is building on each other. So I've said, you know, in prior workshops and interviews, that the New York Press Association is the pace car for the community forum, because their publishers seem to get it. And because of their independent nature and their home roots, having civil conversations and inviting the public and working together on solutions seems to be a natural act. Same thing goes for you. You're very unusual. This program is very unusual among newspapers, in the fact that you publish a newspaper, but you've also got this vehicle to connect the communities. And the potential is unlimited. That's what excites me with it. And you've become an authority on the community forums because you're doing them. Your authority is based on your experiences, and I couldn't encourage you more to do so. And I'm following you here from Richmond, Virginia. I'm excited by what you're doing. I'm excited by the regional aspect of it. I'm excited by the newspaper being in the middle of it. But what really excites me is you have a community that's supporting you. That's going to be vitally important for your future. It's going to be vitally important for newspapers' future. And as they try to figure out, they can't figure it out without community support.
You know, I'll give you an example of just what happened at our last town hall meeting, which was in March. We talked about this issue that's roughly, in New York State, it's called home rule. It's just that local communities can have a say on what they're doing. And the state has done some things that have started to take that away. And that's what that town hall was about. Just last week, in fact, in an area that we cover, our newspaper, I should say, covers, there was an example of this home rule usurpation, if you will, in one of the local communities. We ran it on our front page. Here's the great thing about it, and this issue percolated up, like I said, 3 months ago in the entire region. Several other newspapers picked up on what would have been amounted to not a local story for them. It was a local story for us, but it is local for them, even though the exact event was not local for them. It's local for them because they have similar issues. And what I think the town hall is doing, it is sort of showing this commonality, showing how these different communities are the same. And you want to know what's really great about it is that Republicans and Democrats agree. This is not a partisan thing. This is a where we live thing. And you know, you don't see that happening. You just don't see that happening nationally, and even to some extent, obviously, locally, there's disagreements between the parties. But when they come together on an issue where they share a common vision, to me, that is a sign of progress moving forward. We're kind of sort of at the end of our show. I wish we could continue going on more. Thank you, audience, for asking the questions. You've been very, very involved today. I will say, if you are watching this on replay, obviously you can't see or ask questions, but you can become an audience member just by going to stateof.greaterwesternewyork.com. You can sign up. You will receive the private invitation every Thursday morning with a link that will allow you to become a live audience member, and then you could ask questions for yourself. So I encourage you to do that. Tom, Michelle, thank you very much for participating in today's show. You've been a font of information. Like I said, if you want to stick around after the close, we can talk offline more. But that's it for today's show, everyone. Thanks for being a part of it. Thanks for coming here. And if we can figure out how I can sign off, I will sign off, because everything is always different. All right. We will see you guys next week.